The thermometer read 20 below, and Marcus Chen couldn't feel his fingers anymore. Inside the cabin that was supposed to save him, frost covered the walls like a death shroud. 3 days without firewood, his chainsaw broken, his body shutting down. He'd come to Alaska to escape his failures, but the wilderness doesn't care about your pain, it only tests whether you deserve to survive. In 12 hours, he'd either be dead or discover the one trick that would change everything. The moss growing outside held a secret trappers had known for generations. But would he figure it out before hypothermia claimed him? Marcus Chen pressed his forehead against the cold bus window, watching Seattle's skyline fade into gray October mist. The divorce papers sat folded in his jacket pocket, next to the termination letter from Vertex Engineering. 42 years old, and everything he'd built had crumbled in 60 days. His ex-wife had kept the house. The company had kept his pension. He'd kept nothing but the ache in his chest and a single reckless decision. The Greyhound station in Anchorage smelled like diesel and coffee. Marcus grabbed his 2 duffel bags and stepped into Alaska's autumn cold. He'd bought the cabin sight unseen from a Craigslist ad, $12,000 for remote property with structure. The realtor's photos showed weathered logs and a pitched roof. The listing promised solitude. That was all Marcus wanted now. The bush pilot who flew him out was a grizzled man named Roy, who chewed tobacco and asked no questions. They landed on a gravel strip 40 miles from the nearest town. "That's your place," Roy said, pointing to a dark shape against the tree line. "Radio's in town if you need pickup. Winter comes fast here." Marcus trudged through knee-high grass toward his new home. The cabin was smaller than he'd imagined, maybe 15 by 20 feet. With walls of stacked logs chinked with ancient mortar. Inside, he found a potbelly stove, a wooden cot, and windows covered with plastic sheeting. The floor was dirt. The roof leaked in 3 places, evidenced by water stains on the floorboards. He dropped his bags and sat on the cot, which groaned under his weight. Through the cracked window, he watched Roy's plane disappear into the vast Alaskan sky. The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic, no voices, no lawyers calling about asset division. Just wind through spruce trees and the distant call of a raven. Marcus had wanted escape. He'd found it. Whether he'd survive, it was another question entirely. The first snow came 3 weeks later, in mid-November. Marcus woke to white powder drifting through gaps in the cabin walls. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. The thermometer he'd nailed to the inside wall read 28 degrees. Outside, it was 12. He'd been living on canned soup and instant coffee, heating them on the pot-belly stove that consumed wood faster than he could split it. His hands, soft from years of computer work, had blistered, then calloused. His back ached from sleeping on the sagging cot. Every morning brought new evidence of the cabin's failures. Wind whistled through cracks between logs. Condensation froze on the inside of the windows. The plastic sheeting flapped uselessly against the cold. "You're an idiot, Chen," he muttered, feeding another log into the stove. A certified idiot. His nearest neighbor appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, a woman in her 60s wearing a thick parka and mucklucks. She introduced herself as Ruth Morrison, from a homestead 8 miles north. "Saw your smoke," she said, studying him with sharp blue eyes. "You the city fellow who bought Jim Carver's old trap-line cabin." Marcus Chen. He shook her mittened hand. "I'm settling in." Ruth walked around the cabin, touching the walls, peering at the roof. "This place hasn't been used in 10 years. You got enough firewood? I'm cutting more. You got enough food? Enough. You got any idea how cold it gets out here in January?" Marcus said nothing. Ruth sighed. 60 below, sometimes. This cabin won't keep you alive in that. The chinking's all rotted out. See these gaps? She stuck her finger between 2 logs, and daylight showed through. "You're heating the forest, not the cabin. I'll figure it out. Pride kills people out here faster than cold does." Ruth pulled a business card from her pocket, handwritten with a satellite phone number. "You get in trouble, you call. Don't be stupid." After she left, Marcus examined the walls more carefully. Ruth was right. Everywhere he looked, he found gaps, cracks, places where the original builder's mortar had crumbled away. Some openings were wide enough to slide a pencil through. He'd been fighting a losing battle, trying to heat a sieve. That night, the temperature dropped to 8 degrees. Marcus burned through half his firewood and still woke up shivering. December arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days. Marcus huddled next to the stove, feeding it continuously, watching his carefully stacked woodpile shrink to nothing. On the second day, he ran out of firewood. On the third day, the stove went cold. He tried to start the chainsaw to cut more wood, but the pull cord snapped in his frozen fingers. He tried to split logs with an axe, but his hands were so numb he couldn't grip the handle. By midnight, he couldn't feel his toes. His thoughts became sluggish, confused. He knew these signs. Hypothermia, the beginning of the end. Marcus wrapped himself in both sleeping bags and lay on the cot, teeth chattering violently. Through the window, he could see stars between breaking clouds. Beautiful. Indifferent. He thought about his daughter Emma, who hadn't returned his calls since the divorce. He thought about the bridge he'd helped design in Seattle, still standing, still useful. He thought about Ruth's card, sitting on the shelf by the door. "Get up," he whispered. "Get up, you coward." He forced himself off the cot and stumbled outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow. 20 below, maybe colder. The moon illuminated the forest in silver light. He grabbed an armful of branches from a deadfall spruce and dragged them inside. His fingers barely worked, but he managed to stuff the stove with twigs and newspaper. 3 matches, 4. On the 5th try, flame caught. As feeling returned to his extremities in painful pins and needles, Marcus made himself look at the truth. He was dying, slowly but certainly. The cabin was killing him. He could call Ruth, admit defeat, go back to Anchorage, or he could solve the problem. That's what engineers did. They solved problems. He grabbed his notebook and started sketching. The cabin's heat loss points, the gaps in the walls, the failed chinking, the insufficient insulation. He needed to stop the air from escaping, needed to create a thermal barrier, needed to work with what he had because he wasn't leaving. Not yet, not like this. Morning brought clarity and desperation. Marcus ventured into the forest with a handsaw, looking for materials. He couldn't afford commercial insulation or proper mortar. He needed something natural, abundant, and effective. Something that had kept trees and animals alive in this climate for thousands of years. That's when he saw it. On the north side of every spruce tree, thick cushions of moss grew in dense, fibrous mats. He touched one. It was dry on the surface, but retained moisture underneath, forming a spongy, insulating layer. He pulled a chunk free and examined it. The moss was springy, resistant, naturally antimicrobial. The old-timers in Alaska had probably used it for something. Marcus spent the next week gathering moss. He filled every container he had, letting it dry in layers inside the cabin. He studied how it interlocked, how it held its shape, how it resisted compression. The engineer in him saw what the desperate man needed, a solution. He started with the worst wall, the north-facing side that bore the brunt of the wind. He stuffed dried moss into every gap between the logs, packing it tight with a screwdriver handle. Then he covered the interior wall with overlapping layers of moss, using salvaged wire to hold it in place. The transformation was immediate. That section of wall stopped bleeding heat. Ruth returned on a supply run, bringing flour and salt. She stared at Marcus's moss-covered walls. "What in God's name are you doing?" "Insulating," Marcus said. "Moss holds air pockets, creates a thermal barrier. It's naturally antimicrobial, so it won't rot like organic chinking, and it's waterproof enough to prevent condensation." Ruth touched the wall, feeling the density. "Huh, my grandfather used to talk about this. Said the old Athabascan trappers did something similar. Never seen it myself. Does it make sense?" "Makes sense if it works." "You tested it?" "Working on it." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus covered every interior wall with moss. He packed the ceiling joists. He stuffed the gaps around the windows and door. He created a double layer near the stove to protect against fire while maximizing heat retention. The cabin transformed from a shell into a cocoon. The first real test came on Christmas Eve, when the temperature plummeted to 35 below. Marcus lit the stove in the evening and went to sleep. When he woke at dawn, the cabin was still warm. The stove had burned down to coals, but the heat remained trapped inside his moss sanctuary. For the first time in 2 months, he wasn't shivering. Winter deepened, but Marcus thrived. His moss insulation held against 40 below, 50 below, the brutal January cold that killed exposed skin in minutes. The cabin that had nearly killed him became his fortress. He refined his technique, adding layers where heat loss persisted, creating ventilation channels to prevent moisture buildup. Ruth visited more frequently, bringing supplies and company. She admitted her grandfather had used similar methods, knowledge lost when her generation moved to town. "You've got the old skills in you," she said. "Maybe not from tradition, but from necessity. That counts." In March, as daylight returned and temperatures rose above zero, Marcus stood outside his cabin watching ice melt from the roof. He'd lost 30 pounds. His hands were scarred and rough. His beard was thick and shot through with gray he'd never noticed before. He looked nothing like the broken engineer who'd arrived in October. Emma called on the satellite phone Ruth had loaned him. Her voice cracked when she heard his. "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't call back. Mom said you'd left everything, gone to Alaska. I don't know what I thought. I thought the same things," Marcus said. "That I was running away. Maybe I was. But I found something here, Em. Found out I'm tougher than I believed. Are you coming back?" Marcus looked at his cabin, smoke rising from the chimney into the endless blue sky. "Not yet. I've got work to do here. But I'm not lost anymore. Tell you what, come visit this summer. I'll show you what your old man built." When spring finally broke in April, Marcus helped Ruth repair her greenhouse. He taught her his moss technique, which she adapted for her root cellar. Word spread through the sparse community of homesteaders and trappers. The moss cabin became a local legend, proof that old knowledge could be rediscovered. That survival was about adaptability and persistence. Marcus Chen had come to Alaska to disappear. Instead, he'd found himself. In the gaps between broken logs, in the careful packing of moss, in the discipline of keeping the fire alive, he'd rebuilt something more essential than a cabin. He'd rebuilt the man he'd forgotten he could be, the engineer who solved problems, the father who deserved his daughter's pride, the human who refused to quit. As summer arrived and wildflowers bloomed across the meadow, Marcus sat on his porch watching the sun trace its midnight arc across the horizon. The cabin stood solid behind him, warm and dry, a monument to human resilience. His secret wasn't really secret at all. It was as old as survival itself: adapt, endure, and never stop fighting for one more day.